On a quiet sunny morning, an entitled HOA president marched across a driveway and demanded the unthinkable. She wanted a newborn baby handed over, claiming it was against the rules for a family to raise a child in the community. What she did not know was that the father was a Navy SEAL who had faced war zones darker than any neighborhood dispute. This was not just about petty rules. This was about family, loyalty, and a fight that would shake everyone watching. What happened next will leave you stunned. Tell us where you're watching from. And if you love stories where arrogance meets instant justice, make sure to subscribe. Because tomorrow I have a twist even bigger than this one. The first weeks in that neighborhood had already been tense. My wife and I had just moved in, wanting a quiet place to raise our baby. I had served years as a Navy SEAL, and I thought civilian life would be calm compared to what I had seen overseas. But I soon learned that battles take different forms. Some are fought on foreign soil with weapons and tactics. Others are fought on home soil with words, papers, and twisted rules. And sometimes the enemy is not foreign at all, but standing right across the street. Karen, the HOA president, had started with little things. Notices about our trash cans being out too long. Complaints about the color of our shutters even though they were HOA approved. Letters about my wife's flower pots being too close to the walkway. It was petty harassment that I thought we could ignore. But when she saw us with the baby, her attitude grew darker. She made comments about how newborns were noisy and disruptive. She said babies did not belong in peaceful communities. I brushed it off as another entitled remark until the morning she stood in front of us demanding our child. My wife clutched our newborn tighter and looked at me with fear in her eyes. The baby stirred and whimpered at the tension. I stepped forward, between Karen and my family. Years of discipline kept my voice calm but firm. I told her that no one was taking my child away. She smirked and pulled out a paper folded neatly in her hand. She waved it like it was a weapon. She claimed it was a new HOA regulation that any resident with an infant under 6 months had to submit the baby for an inspection by the board. She said the board had the right to remove the baby from the household if conditions were found unsuitable. It was absurd and illegal, but she said it with such conviction that I could see a neighbor down the street pause and watch with concern. My wife's face turned pale. Karen pointed at her and repeated her demand. She wanted my wife to hand over our newborn right then and there. My hands curled into fists at my side, but I kept control. I knew from experience that anger without strategy was wasted energy. This was not the battlefield, but it was still a fight, and in fights, you always gather intel first. I asked her where this supposed rule came from. She smiled smugly and said she wrote it and the board voted on it last week. She said the HOA had the right to protect the community from disruptive influences, including crying babies. She called my child a disturbance. My wife gasped. That single word cut deeper than any insult she had thrown before. I told her she was out of line. She raised her chin and said if we refused to comply, she would bring in authorities. She turned on her heel and stormed off. My wife sat back down with the baby shaking. I reassured her, but inside I was boiling. I had faced enemies with rifles and explosives, yet I had rarely felt such fury as I did toward that woman. She thought she could bully a family by twisting community rules. She thought we would roll over, but she had no idea who she was dealing with. I did not announce to neighbors what I had done in the military. I kept that part of my life quiet. But Karen had just opened a door she would regret for the rest of her life. That night, I stayed up late watching over my family. Every sound outside put me on alert. I remembered missions overseas where we protected civilians from threats in the dark. This time the civilians were my wife and my baby. The threat was just across the street. I began to plan. I did not want to fight. I wanted peace, but I knew people like Karen never stopped until they were stopped. I started documenting everything. Every notice she sent, every comment she made, every witness who heard her words. My training had taught me that evidence was as powerful as any weapon, and I was ready to use it. The next morning she returned with 2 other board members at her side. They stood on the sidewalk like a tribunal. She announced loudly that she was giving us a final warning. She demanded compliance or she would escalate. She said she would file a report claiming our baby was living in unsafe conditions. She claimed she had already drafted the complaint. My wife's hands trembled as she held the baby. I could feel the neighbors watching from behind curtains. She was putting on a show of power. I stepped forward and told her she was making a serious mistake. I told her there are some battles you cannot win no matter how much power you think you hold. She laughed in my face. She said people like me always think they are above the rules. She said she had taken down families before and she would take down ours. Then she turned and left with her followers. I stood there in silence. My wife whispered, asking what we would do. I looked at my child's tiny face and made a promise right then. I would not let Karen win. She thought she was the authority. She thought she was the law. She had no idea that in my world I had faced down worse than her, and this time I had more than duty at stake. I had my family, and I would defend them with everything I had. The following day, the sun was just coming up when I saw Karen pacing in her driveway on her phone. Her voice carried across the quiet street. She was speaking fast, gesturing with her hands, pointing at her house every few seconds. I knew that call was about us. My wife peeked through the curtains holding the baby close. Her fear was plain. She asked me if they could really take our child. I told her no one was going to take anything from us, but I could feel her trembling. Against my arm, Karen had planted fear, and fear is a weapon she loved to use. By mid-morning, a white sedan pulled up. 2 men in plain shirts stepped out carrying clipboards. They looked official but not like police. Karen strutted across the lawn to meet them as if she had summoned an army. She pointed to our porch and began explaining something with exaggerated hand movements. One of the men nodded politely and walked toward our house. The other hung back. Speaking with Karen, my wife whispered, asking if they were police. I shook my head. They looked like social services, exactly what Karen had threatened. She had filed a complaint against us. She had called child welfare. I opened the door before they could knock. The first man introduced himself as a caseworker. He explained that a complaint had been filed alleging unsafe living conditions for an infant in our home. My wife gasped. I kept my voice steady and invited them in. They glanced at each other and stepped inside. The baby was asleep in the crib. The house was spotless. My wife had gone over every detail during the night, trying to calm herself. The caseworker looked around, checked the kitchen, asked a few questions, and scribbled notes. Meanwhile, through the window I could see Karen craning her neck trying to watch. She was practically bouncing with anticipation. She wanted to see us humiliated. The second caseworker asked about my employment. I told him I was retired military. He nodded and made a note. He asked if I had any history of violence. I looked him in the eye and said only in service to my country. He blinked and quickly looked back at his paper. My wife offered them coffee. They declined. After 15 minutes of questions, they closed their folders. The lead caseworker said everything appeared safe and stable. He said they would complete the report but saw no reason for further action. Relief washed over my wife's face. But as they left, Karen intercepted them. She gestured wildly, pointing again at our house. The caseworker held up a hand to silence her. He said his job was done. He got in the car and drove off. Karen's smile twisted into rage. She had failed, but she would not stop. That night, my wife begged me to consider moving. She said the stress was too much. She said maybe Karen would never stop until we left. I listened, but I shook my head. Running was not in my blood. I had not spent years learning to face fear and pressure, only to run from a neighborhood bully. I told her Karen was picking a war she could not win. She looked at me uncertainly, but I could see a flicker of hope in her eyes. She had seen me face danger before. She knew when I spoke with that kind of certainty, I meant it. The next morning, Karen came again, but this time she was not alone. With her was a man in a slick suit carrying a leather briefcase. He introduced himself loudly as the HOA attorney. He claimed we were in violation of multiple bylaws. He rattled off nonsense about noise complaints and unapproved renovations. My wife whispered that we had done none of those things. I already knew. This was intimidation. Karen smirked as he spoke. She thought she had found backup, but I recorded every word on my phone. When I asked for written copies of these alleged violations, he refused. He said the board had discretion. I told him the law does not bow to discretion. He frowned and closed his briefcase. Karen hissed at him, but he walked away. Even her hired mouthpiece was unwilling to push too far. That afternoon, I got a knock on the door. It was our neighbor, Mike, a retired sheriff who lived 3 houses down. He had seen the caseworkers and the lawyer. He said he had dealt with Karen's type before. He offered to keep watch, and if needed, he would testify about what he had witnessed. I thanked him. Having someone with his background on our side gave my wife a sense of relief. Karen had tried to isolate us, but now support was quietly building. The days that followed were tense. Karen would drive slowly past our house, glaring, sometimes snapping photos with her phone. One night, I found a notice taped to our door claiming fines of thousands of dollars for alleged violations. It was unsigned and unofficial. I kept it as evidence. My wife cried herself to sleep. The baby stirred at her distress. I sat awake listening to the night. I thought of the many nights overseas when silence meant danger. Now silence meant Karen was plotting her next move. The breaking point came one Saturday morning. My wife was walking the baby in the stroller. Along the sidewalk, Karen stormed up, shouting that the stroller was blocking community pathways. She tried to grab the stroller handle. My wife froze in fear. I ran out the door in seconds and stepped between them. I told her to take her hands off my family. She sneered and said she was within her rights. I told her flatly that if she touched my child again, she would regret it. My voice was low, but the weight behind it made her step back. She spat out that she would have us removed by force. Then she stormed away. Neighbors peered from behind blinds. Some shook their heads. Others whispered. Slowly, people were realizing how far she was going. That night, I sat on the porch holding the baby against my chest. My wife sat beside me exhausted. I promised her again that no one was taking our child. I told her Karen was escalating because she was losing. She could not stand to be defied, but her arrogance would be her downfall. I had seen it before in far more dangerous people. They push and push until they expose themselves. And when they do, there is no going back. I began preparing for the inevitable. I gathered all documents, notices, recordings. I spoke again with Mike, the retired sheriff. He confirmed he had cameras on his property that captured Karen harassing us on the street. He offered to share the footage. I thanked him and felt a deep sense of calm. Karen thought she was building a case against us. She had no idea I was building a case against her, one far stronger than anything she could imagine. The next week started with a storm, but not the kind that comes from the sky. On Tuesday afternoon, a squad car pulled into the neighborhood. Karen was standing at the curb waving her arms like she had summoned backup. My wife panicked, thinking this time it was real police coming for us. She grabbed the baby and held him tight. I told her to stay calm. I stepped onto the porch and waited as two uniformed officers approached. Their faces were professional but not hostile. Karen trailed behind them, barking accusations. She claimed we were a danger to the neighborhood. She said our child was in unsafe conditions. She said we had weapons stashed illegally. I could almost hear the glee in her voice. She thought this was the moment she would win. The officers asked to speak privately. I invited them inside. They looked around, saw the baby resting in the crib, saw my wife's anxious face. One of them asked if there were firearms in the home. I answered honestly, yes, I had a secured gun safe with weapons I was legally licensed to own. He nodded. He asked about noise complaints. I told him no music, no parties, just family life. He seemed to believe me. Then I produced the notices Karen had taped to our door. I showed them the unsigned fines, the recordings of her screaming at us, the footage from Mike's cameras showing her trying to grab the stroller. The officers' expressions shifted. They realized quickly what was going on. They thanked me for my cooperation and said they would write a report. They stepped outside and spoke to Karen. Her shrill voice carried as she argued with them. Finally, one officer raised his hand and told her sternly to stop filing false reports. She shouted that she was president of the HOA and had authority. The officer replied that HOA rules do not override the law. Then they got in the car and left. Karen stood frozen on the curb, her mouth working but no sound coming out. She had lost another battle. That night, my wife cried tears of relief. She said maybe it was finally over. I shook my head. Karen was too far gone to stop now. Each failure would only make her more desperate. I told her we had to be ready for whatever came next. She asked how I could stay so calm. I told her the truth. I had faced worse. Fear loses its grip once you have walked through fire. She nodded and held my hand. Days passed quietly, but I stayed alert. Karen's house was dark most evenings, but her blinds would twitch. She was watching. Sometimes a car I did not recognize would slow down in front of our home. I noted the license plates. I had learned long ago that observation is the first defense. Mike, the retired sheriff, shared more footage. Each clip showed Karen pacing near our driveway, sometimes muttering to herself, sometimes pointing at our house as if rehearsing. My wife said she looked unstable. I agreed. Pressure was breaking her. The next escalation came on a Sunday morning. We were loading the baby into the car seat when a man in another suit walked up with a clipboard. He said he was here to deliver a summons from the HOA board. He claimed we were being fined $5,000 for repeated violations. I asked to see the specific violations. He waved vaguely at the paper. I told him this was unenforceable and likely fraudulent. He smirked and said the board had full authority. I looked him straight in the eyes and told him that fraud in writing is a crime. He faltered, muttered something, and shoved the paper into my hand before walking quickly back to his car. Karen stood on her porch smiling. She thought she had scored a victory. She had no idea she had just handed me more evidence. Later that afternoon, I called an attorney who specialized in HOA disputes. I explained the situation and sent him copies of everything. He agreed Karen had no legal ground and advised me to hold steady. He said with the amount of harassment documented, we could countersue if it came to that. My wife felt a little safer knowing we had professional backup, but I told her we were not waiting for court to save us. We were preparing every step. That evening Mike came by again. He said he had spoken with a few other neighbors. Quietly, they were fed up with Karen too. She had bullied them over gardens, mailboxes, even the color of their drapes, but most had stayed silent out of fear. Now seeing her targeter so viciously was pushing them to speak up, I told him to gather anyone willing. If this went to a board vote or a meeting, numbers would matter. He nodded and promised he would spread the word. That night, after my wife and baby were asleep, I sat alone on the porch. The neighborhood looked peaceful, but I knew the storm was still building. I thought about my training, about how patience and pressure could win battles without ever firing a shot. Karen was burning her own credibility faster than I could have planned. The more she attacked, the more evidence stacked against her. I whispered a promise to my sleeping child. No one was going to take him. No one. The following week, Karen tried yet another tactic. She hosted an emergency HOA meeting in her backyard. Flyers appeared in mailboxes claiming urgent rule changes were needed. I attended quietly. My wife stayed home with the baby. About 20 neighbors gathered in folding chairs. Karen stood at the front with a binder full of papers. She announced a proposal that all families with children under 2 must submit to random home inspections for safety compliance. Gasps rippled through the crowd. She claimed it was for the good of the community. She tried to spin it as child protection, but everyone could see it was targeted directly at us. I raised my hand. She ignored me. I raised it again and spoke loudly. I told everyone present that federal law protects families from such overreach. I told them Karen had already filed false reports against us and that her actions bordered on harassment and fraud. Murmurs spread through the crowd. Some neighbors nodded in agreement. Others whispered uneasily. Karen shouted for order. She slammed her binder shut and stormed away. The meeting dissolved into chatter. For the first time, the tide was turning. People were questioning her. That night, Karen's porch light stayed off. Her blinds were closed. For once, her house looked small and silent. My wife said maybe she was finished. I said no. People like her do not quit. They double down. And when they do, that is when they make their biggest mistake. I had learned to wait for that mistake, and it was coming. The calm did not last long. By Thursday evening, I heard a noise near the garage. It was faint at first, like metal scraping. I moved quickly and silently to the side window. The sight that greeted me was both ridiculous and dangerous. Karen was crouched by my garage door with a crowbar in her hand. Her hair was messy, her face tight with frustration. She was trying to pry open the side lock. I slipped out the back door and circled quietly until I was right behind her. She was so focused, she did not hear me approach. I stood tall and said, in a steady voice, that breaking and entering was a crime. She jolted upright, dropping the crowbar, her face twisted with fury. She screamed that as HOA president, she had authority to inspect all properties. I told her that authority ended at the sidewalk, and what she was doing was a felony. She spat words back at me, calling me unfit, saying our child was in danger, claiming she was protecting the community. I told her she was crossing a line that could not be uncrossed. She stomped off, leaving the tool behind. I took pictures of everything, then called Mike, the retired sheriff. He arrived within minutes. When he saw the crowbar, his jaw tightened. He said she was escalating and it was only a matter of time before she did something that landed her in. cliffs. He urged me to stay vigilant. I told him I already was. The next day my wife was shaken. She asked what would happen if Karen tried again while I was gone. I reassured her that I would never leave them unprotected, but I also began planning more measures. I reinforced the locks and added more cameras. I placed motion lights across the yard. Nothing was going to catch us off guard again. On Saturday afternoon, Karen struck again. This time it was broad daylight. She marched right up the walkway with 2 men behind her. They wore cheap jackets with makeshift badges pinned on. She introduced them loudly as HOA enforcement officers. She declared that they were here to seize our property for violations. My wife clutched the baby. Neighbors peeked from windows. I stepped forward and told her she had no legal right to enter. She shoved a piece of paper toward me and screamed that she had authority. I scanned the page. It was nonsense, full of misspelled words and invented rules. I told her she was trespassing and that bringing fake officers only made it worse. One of the men shifted nervously. The other crossed his arms but said nothing. Karen shouted that she would call the police on me. I smiled and said, "Please do." She froze, realizing her bluff was collapsing. The 2 men glanced at each other, then quietly backed away. She shouted at them to stand their ground, but they ignored her. Within seconds, she was alone on my lawn. She screamed once more about authority, then stormed off. The neighbors who had been watching whispered among themselves. Karen was losing them. That night, Mike came by again. He said several neighbors had knocked on his door asking if they could help. He told them to keep records of any harassment, to save every note and flyer. He said we were building a case stronger than any single witness could provide. My wife felt relief knowing we were not alone anymore. For the first time, she believed the neighborhood might finally stand against Karen. But Karen was not finished. On Monday morning, a letter arrived. It bore a fake seal at the top, reading Community Authority Office. It demanded immediate surrender of our newborn to HOA custody for safety evaluation. My wife nearly fainted when she read it. She clutched the baby and cried. I took the letter, scanned it, and saved it as evidence. I told her this was the mistake. I had been waiting for. Karen had finally crossed into outright fraud and attempted kidnapping. I contacted our attorney and sent him the document. His reply came within the hour. He said this was beyond civil dispute. He advised immediate police involvement. That evening, 2 officers arrived at our door. I handed them the fake letter, the photos of the crowbar, the recordings from the cameras, and the notices Karen had delivered. They studied everything carefully. One officer said he had heard of Karen before. She had a reputation for calling complaints that never checked out. But this, he said, was different. This was criminal. They promised to escalate the case to detectives. My wife asked if Karen could really take our baby. The officer shook his head firmly. No, she has no authority whatsoever. He told her to stay calm and trust the process. For the first time in weeks, I saw my wife breathe normally. Still, I did not trust the process alone. My training told me to prepare for the worst while hoping for the best. That night, I stayed awake, sitting on the porch in the dark, listening to the crickets and the hum of streetlights. My eyes swept the shadows. My ears picked up every sound. Hours passed slowly. At 2 in the morning, a shape appeared at the edge of the yard. It was Karen again. She stood there staring at the house, her face pale in the moonlight, her hair wild. She clutched a folder in her hands and muttered to herself. I could not hear the words, but the tone was manic. She stood there for nearly 10 minutes, then turned and walked back toward her home. I stayed seated, heart steady. I knew she was unraveling. The next morning, I gathered with Mike and 2 other neighbors. We shared notes and footage. Together we built a timeline of harassment stretching back months. Mike said it was more than enough to take before a judge. One of the neighbors, an older woman, said Karen had once tried to fine her for hanging a bird feeder. Another said Karen had screamed at his kids for riding bikes on the sidewalk. The stories poured out. It was clear she had been ruling by fear, but fear only lasts until people unite. Now the neighborhood was uniting. By the end of the week, the police had visited Karen's home. They left with a stack of papers and boxes. Rumors spread that she was being investigated for fraud and harassment. She denied everything, screaming that it was a setup. But the more she screamed, the less people believed her. For the first time, her power was crumbling. And for the first time, I felt the tide truly shift. My wife smiled again. My baby slept peacefully. Karen had declared war, but she had no idea she had already lost it. The following week brought a strange, calm. Karen kept her distance, though I could feel her watching from across the street. She stood by her window for long stretches, curtains drawn back, her gaze locked on our house. My wife avoided the front rooms, carrying the baby through the halls in silence. The tension was heavy, like waiting for a storm. But behind the scenes, the real storm was already building. Detectives called me to confirm they had opened a formal investigation. They said the evidence I provided, especially the fake custody letter, was enough to pursue criminal charges. They asked if I was willing to testify when the time came. I told them without hesitation that I would. Mike visited often. He said neighbors had begun sharing their own files with the police. Photos, letters, videos. Each piece of evidence was another nail in Karen's case. One family even had recordings of her screaming threats late at night. Another had footage of her sneaking through backyards with a flashlight. It became clear that her harassment of us was not isolated. It was part of a long pattern. She had ruled with fear for years, and now that fear was dissolving. One evening as the sun set, I sat on the porch rocking the baby gently in my arms. The air was warm, the sky painted orange and pink. For a moment, everything felt normal. Then a car pulled up. Out stepped a man in a suit carrying a briefcase. He walked briskly across the lawn and introduced himself as Richard Hale, attorney for the HOA. His smile was thin, his eyes cold. He said he was here to discuss violations. I told him I was not interested. He handed me a folder and insisted I review it. Inside were fabricated complaints, dozens of them, all signed by Karen. He said if I did not comply, the HOA would pursue civil action. I asked him if he had any idea what his client had been doing. His smirk told me he did, and he did not care. He warned me that fighting the HOA could be costly. I told him I had no problem paying the price if it meant exposing the truth. His smirk faded. He tucked his folder away and walked back to his car without another word. Later that night, Mike knocked on the door. He had been sheriff long enough to recognize Richard Hale's name. He said the man was known for shady tactics, using intimidation to silence homeowners. Mike warned that Karen and Hale were working together, desperate to protect their hold on the neighborhood. But Mike also said something else. He told me that when corrupt people feel their power slipping, they often make desperate mistakes. He advised me to stay sharp. I told him I always do. Days passed quietly until Friday morning. I was pouring coffee when pounding shook the front door. I opened it to find two uniformed officers. My wife froze in fear. One officer explained they had received an anonymous tip claiming our child was in danger. They were required to perform a welfare check. I nodded calmly, invited them inside, and handed them the baby, who was smiling and healthy. My wife showed them the nursery, the stocked fridge, the clean home. The officers noted everything carefully. After half an hour, they apologized for the intrusion. They admitted it was clear the call had been malicious. I asked if they would record the false report. They assured me they would, and added that this kind of harassment would not be tolerated. After they left, my wife broke down in tears. She said she felt hunted, like no matter what we did, Karen would keep coming. I held her close and promised again that we would win. I reminded her that each act only added weight to Karen's downfall. My words steadied her, though the fear lingered in her eyes. That evening, a knock came again. This time, it was not police or lawyers. It was our neighbor, Lisa. She was a quiet woman who usually kept to herself. She stood nervously on the porch, clutching a small USB drive. She said she had installed security cameras around her property months ago because Karen had been harassing her family. The cameras caught something important. She handed me the drive and said to give it to the detectives. I thanked her and asked what was on it. Her eyes lowered. She said Karen had been sneaking into yards at night, sometimes carrying folders, sometimes carrying tools. She had even tried Lisa's door once. My wife gasped. Lisa said she had stayed silent out of fear, but seeing Karen target our baby pushed her to speak up. That night, I loaded the footage onto my computer. The videos were clear. Karen creeping around, muttering to herself, trying door handles, peering into windows. She looked less like a president and more like a prowler. The timestamps matched nights when neighbors reported strange noises. I copied the files and sent them directly to the detectives. The reply came quickly. They said this was exactly the kind of evidence that would hold up in court. The next day brought yet another twist. Karen's husband, a quiet man named Howard, approached me as I was checking the mailbox. He looked exhausted, his shoulders sagging. He said he could not take it anymore. He admitted Karen had become unstable, obsessed with power and control. He said she barely slept, pacing the house, writing notes, ranting about conspiracies. He confessed that he had seen her write the fake custody letter and that he was willing to testify against her. My eyes narrowed. I asked why now. He said because he was scared she would hurt someone, maybe even herself. His voice cracked. He said he still cared for her, but she had gone too far. I thanked him and told him the truth, that stepping forward might be the only way to save her from herself. He nodded weakly and walked away. My wife watched from the window, stunned. She whispered that maybe this was the break we needed. I agreed. The walls were closing in on Karen. That weekend, the neighborhood gathered at Mike's home. Nearly every family attended. People shared stories of harassment, fines, and threats. Some had boxes of notices stretching back years. Others spoke of confrontations at meetings, of shouting and intimidation. It became clear Karen had built her throne on fear. But the fear was gone now. In its place was resolve. Together we drafted a petition calling for her immediate removal from the HOA board. Every homeowner signed. Mike promised to deliver it. At the next meeting, when I walked home that night with my wife beside me and our baby asleep in her arms, I felt something shift. The neighborhood no longer belonged to Karen. It belonged to the people again. She just did not know it yet. But she would soon. And when she did, the fall would be harder than she ever imagined. The petition spread like wildfire. By Monday morning, copies had circulated through the entire neighborhood, and nearly every mailbox carried a signature page demanding Karen's removal. People who had once stayed silent now spoke openly, shaking hands and sharing relief as though a fog had lifted. My wife walked with a stroller down the block, and neighbors stopped her to say they were behind us. The support brought her to tears. For the first time since moving in, she felt safe walking outside again. That safety would not last long. Karen was about to erupt. The HOA meeting was scheduled for Wednesday evening. Mike volunteered to deliver the petition then. Until that day, we kept our heads down, staying focused on family. But tension simmered. On Tuesday morning, I noticed Karen pacing in her driveway with her phone pressed to her ear. She gestured wildly, her voice sharp and angry. Later, Mike told me she had been calling board members, begging them not to side with the neighbors. Her power was slipping, and she could feel it. That night, the baby finally slept a full stretch, and my wife and I shared a quiet moment on the porch. The calm was broken by shouting from across the street. Karen stormed out of her house, screaming at her husband, Howard. Lights flicked on in surrounding homes as people peeked through blinds. Howard's voice was faint but desperate. He kept saying she needed help, that this was not normal anymore. Karen shrieked that he was betraying her, that the neighborhood was hers to control. She spotted us watching and jabbed a finger toward our house, yelling that she would make sure we paid. Then she vanished inside, slamming the door so hard the windows rattled. My wife clutched my arm. I told her not to worry. Karen's meltdown was only adding fuel to her downfall. The next day arrived, hot and heavy with humidity. By evening, the community center was packed. Families filled every chair. Children sat cross-legged on the floor. Even retirees who rarely attended shuffled in to see the show. Karen entered late, dressed in her usual blazer, hair frizzed from stress, eyes darting. With paranoia, she carried a thick folder, papers spilling out, muttering under her breath. When she saw Mike at the podium, she froze. He raised the petition high, his voice steady. He declared that the neighborhood no longer trusted Karen to represent them, and demanded a vote of no confidence. Applause thundered. Karen slammed her folder on the table, yelling that the petition was invalid, that everyone here was breaking rules. Her words drowned in the noise. One by one, board members raised their hands in agreement with Mike. It was unanimous. Karen was stripped of her presidency. The room erupted with cheers. For a moment, Karen looked stunned, like she had been punched. Then her face twisted into rage. She pointed at me in the crowd, accusing me of orchestrating everything. She shouted that I was dangerous, that my military past made me unfit to raise a child. The words silenced the room. My wife stood, trembling but strong, and told Karen she would never understand the meaning of sacrifice or family. The crowd applauded again, louder than before. Karen's face went crimson. She screamed that none of this was over and stormed out of the hall. The The victory felt sweet, but I knew it was not the end. People gathered outside afterward, congratulating us, thanking us. Mike warned me to stay alert. He said Karen had lost her throne, but not her obsession. He predicted she would lash out harder than before. His words proved true. That very night, Karen tried again. At 2 in the morning, I woke to the sound of footsteps on gravel. I rose quietly, checking the window. A shadow moved near our driveway. I grabbed my phone and slipped outside, staying in the dark. The figure came into view. It was Karen. She crouched by the car, pulling a small bottle from her pocket. I recognized the smell instantly. Bleach. She was pouring it across the hood. I stepped forward, my voice sharp. She froze, then bolted, the bottle clattering to the ground. I shouted after her that the cameras caught everything. She cursed and ran back inside. My wife appeared at the door, holding the baby tight. I told her it was fine, that this was the final nail. We had the footage, and this time there would be no escaping consequences. The next morning I delivered the video to the detectives. They watched in silence, then exchanged glances. They said this was exactly the proof needed for criminal charges, combined with the fake custody letter, the harassment, the trespassing, the false police report, and now vandalism. The case against her was ironclad. They assured me an arrest warrant would be prepared. I left the station feeling lighter, as though a weight had lifted. For the first time in months, I believed we were close to the end. That evening Howard came by again. His face was drawn, his voice hollow. He said Karen had stopped sleeping altogether. She paced the house, muttering about conspiracies, claiming everyone was out to destroy her. He begged me to understand that the woman he married was gone, replaced by someone consumed by control. I told him I understood, and I asked if he was ready to testify. He nodded slowly. He said he would do whatever it took to stop her spiral. The following day, Karen made one last desperate move. She drove through the neighborhood blasting a megaphone, screaming that the HOA had been taken over by traitors. Children ran inside. Parents stared in disbelief. She parked in front of my house and shouted that I had stolen her power, that she would never forgive us. I stood on the porch, calm and steady, the baby resting in my arms. Neighbors filmed her meltdown, shaking their heads. Sirens wailed in the distance. When police cars turned the corner, Karen dropped the megaphone and tried to run, but there was nowhere left to hide. Officers surrounded her, hands firm but careful, as they placed her in cuffs. Her screams echoed down the street. The neighborhood watched in silence as Karen was led away. Some looked shocked, others relieved. My wife leaned into me, whispering that it was finally over, but I knew better. The arrest was a milestone, not the end. Court still waited. And in that courtroom, the full truth would finally come out. The morning after Karen's arrest, the neighborhood buzzed with talk. People lingered at mailboxes, sharing updates they had heard. Some said she was still in holding. Others claimed she had already made bail. My wife and I tried to keep our routine steady. The baby still needed feedings and naps no matter what. Storm raged outside, but beneath the calm, our nerves tightened. We both knew this was only the start of the legal fight. Later that day, a detective called. He confirmed Karen had been arraigned and released on bond until trial. He said the charges included vandalism, harassment, trespassing, and interference. With a family, he warned, she had hired a lawyer known for aggressive tactics, a man named Collins, who often represented shady HOA boards. The detective assured me the case was strong, but he urged us to remain careful. People like Karen did not go down quietly. When word spread that she was free, the community grew uneasy again. That evening I saw curtains twitching nervously whenever her car rolled by. Howard, her husband, came to us once more. His eyes carried exhaustion. He confessed he could not live under her madness anymore. He said he would testify about her threats and her obsession, and he also revealed something chilling. He showed us a hidden notebook she kept, filled with lists of infractions against nearly every family in the neighborhood. Some were petty things like grass height, others bordered on delusion. Beside our names, she had scribbled unfit parents in large dark ink. I photographed the pages and sent them to the detectives immediately. They told me this evidence would help establish her state of mind. The trial date was set for 3 weeks later. In that time, Karen tried to act normal, but her anger kept boiling over. She filed motions through her lawyer claiming the video footage was tampered with. She sent letters to neighbors demanding they withdraw their support for the petition. None of it worked. The neighborhood had finally found its voice, and no one was going back to silence. The day of court arrived. My wife and I dressed carefully, bringing documents, photos, and the video evidence. I carried myself with the same calm I had learned on deployments. Inside the courthouse, Karen sat at the defense table beside Collins. She looked thinner, her blazer hanging loose, eyes darting with restless energy. Collins leaned close, whispering instructions, but she barely seemed to hear him. Across the aisle, Howard sat quietly, avoiding her gaze. When she spotted him, her face twisted with betrayal. The proceedings began with the state presenting the video of her pouring bleach on my car. The footage played on a large screen. Every detail crisp. Gasps rippled through the room. Collins objected loudly, claiming the camera angle made it unclear. The judge overruled him. Then came the testimony about her fake custody letter. The officer who had responded that day described her false claim that our baby was in danger. My wife's eyes filled with tears hearing it again, but she held steady. When Howard took the stand, the room grew silent. He spoke softly at first, then with more strength. He told the court about her late-night pacing, her obsession with rules, her threats to families, and her spiral into paranoia. Karen shook her head violently, muttering under her breath. Collins tried to discredit Howard, calling him a bitter spouse, but Howard remained calm, saying he had loved Karen once, but the person she had become was dangerous to everyone, including herself. His words carried weight. I saw the jury listening closely. Then Mike, the neighbor with cameras, testified. He explained how he had installed the system for security and how it captured Karen's actions clearly. He described her behavior at HOA meetings, her outbursts, her attempts to intimidate families. His testimony painted a picture of a woman who saw control as her only mission. Karen snapped at him from the defense table, calling him a liar. The judge sternly warned her to remain silent or risk contempt. She folded her arms but kept glaring, daggers at us all. Finally, I took the stand. I recounted the harassment, the trespassing, the fake complaint, and the night she tried to vandalize our car. I explained my background, my service, and why protecting my wife and newborn was my only focus. Collins tried to corner me, suggesting I had provoked Karen. I kept my answers steady, reminding him the evidence spoke for itself. At one point he sneered that I was using my military past to play hero. I simply said service had taught me calm, not aggression. The jury seemed to understand. By the afternoon, both sides had made their arguments. Collins flailed with technicalities, but the state's case was solid. As the judge prepared instructions for the jury, Karen erupted. She stood, suddenly, shouting that the entire neighborhood was conspiring against her, that I was dangerous, that the judge was biased. Bailiffs rushed forward as she screamed at Howard for betraying her. The courtroom shook with the chaos. The judge ordered her removed until she could regain control. Collins slumped in his seat, his case unraveling. The jury deliberated for only 2 hours. When they returned, the verdict was clear. Guilty on all counts. The judge read the charges aloud and announced sentencing would follow the next week. Karen sat back down, pale and trembling. For the first time, her arrogance cracked into fear. Collins whispered to her, but she stared blankly ahead. Howard buried his face in his hands. The courtroom emptied slowly, neighbors gathering in the hallway to thank us, to share relief that the nightmare was nearing its end. That night, we returned home exhausted. My wife held the baby close, whispering that maybe we could finally breathe again. I told her we would wait for sentencing. But yes, this chapter was closing. Mike came by with a bottle of sparkling cider. We toasted quietly on the porch, neighbors waving as they passed. For the first time, the air felt lighter, as though the neighborhood had shed a heavy weight. Still, I knew sentencing would be the true closure, and until then we would remain watchful. The week between the verdict and sentencing felt like suspended time. We tried to live normally, yet every moment carried an undercurrent of waiting. My wife focused on the baby, rocking him gently while humming soft lullabies. I kept myself busy repairing a fence post and cleaning the garage, anything to keep from staring at the calendar. But every evening, as the sun dipped low, we both sat quietly, knowing the final word was yet to come. When sentencing day arrived, the courthouse felt different. There was no longer the charged tension of a trial. Instead, there was a quiet heaviness, as though everyone recognized the gravity of what would be decided. Karen entered flanked by deputies, her blazer rumpled, hair untidy. Her eyes darted wildly across the room. Some said she had not slept in days. Collins followed behind, his shoulders sagging. He knew what was coming. The judge began by reviewing the convictions: harassment, trespassing, vandalism, false reports, and obstruction. He emphasized that interfering with a family, particularly targeting a newborn, carried profound weight. Karen twisted in her seat, whispering furiously to Collins, who kept his gaze on the floor. The judge then called forward witnesses who wished to give final statements. Howard was the first. His voice trembled, but his words were steady. He said he had tried for years to help Karen, but her obsession with control had consumed her. He admitted he had once hoped she could change, but now he feared for anyone who remained under her influence. His closing words struck deep. He said, "Sometimes the hardest act of love is admitting you can no longer protect someone from themselves." Karen sneered at him, muttering betrayal, but the court listened in silence. Then Mike spoke. He said he installed cameras to protect his property, but never imagined they would expose the depth of cruelty living next door. He described the fear neighbors had endured, the intimidation, the threats. He reminded the judge this was not a single act, but a long campaign. His tone was calm, but his words carried the weight of an entire community. Finally, I spoke. I explained once more that my only goal had been to protect my wife and child. I said our family had come home from service hoping for peace, only to find ourselves under siege by someone meant to lead fairly. I asked the judge not only for justice but for assurance that Karen could not continue her campaign of control. I finished by saying forgiveness was possible, but accountability was necessary first. The judge nodded, then turned to Karen. He asked if she wished to speak. She rose slowly, her face contorted between anger and fear. She shouted that the community was corrupt, that I was violent, that everyone was blind. She said the baby was not safe, and that she had only tried to save him. Her words spilled out in chaotic fragments, painting no clear picture. The courtroom grew restless. Collins placed a hand on her shoulder, urging her to stop, but she shoved him away. Finally, deputies guided her back to her seat. After a long pause, the judge delivered his decision. He sentenced Karen to 2 years in county jail, a $5,000 fine, and mandatory community service upon release. But then he added something unexpected. He ordered a full psychiatric evaluation. He said her behavior during trial and in the community suggested deeper issues of mental health. Depending on the evaluation, she might spend her sentence in a treatment facility instead of standard confinement. The courtroom buzzed with whispers. It was the first moment where compassion crept into the conversation, not just punishment. Karen sat frozen. For the first time, her eyes no longer darted in anger. They seemed distant, almost lost. Collins leaned in and explained quietly. She nodded faintly, as though she barely grasped his words. The deputies led her away in handcuffs. Her shoulders slumped. The image stayed with me. Not a proud tyrant anymore, but a woman broken by her own illusions. Outside the courthouse, neighbors gathered. Some cheered the verdict. Others shook their heads with pity. Howard approached us. He said he would support the psychiatric evaluation. He no longer wanted to see her rot in anger. He wanted her to finally confront her illness. My wife placed a hand on his arm, thanking him for his courage. It was not easy to testify against family, yet he had done it. That evening back home, the neighborhood held an impromptu gathering. Families brought folding chairs and coolers, sitting in driveways as children played with sparklers. For the first time in months, laughter filled the air. People spoke openly about their relief, about the hope that peace had returned. Mike raised a glass, saying, "Here is to a community that found its voice." The crowd cheered softly. Later that night, as I held the baby on the porch, the weight of the ordeal pressed down. My wife sat beside me, her eyes tired yet hopeful. I told her justice had been served, though part of me still carried the image of Karen being led away. She asked if I felt sorry for her. I said I did, but I also felt relieved that our child could grow up safe, free from fear. She nodded and leaned against me. Days turned into weeks. Life began to settle. The baby grew stronger, his eyes bright, his laugh infectious. The neighbors slowly rebuilt trust. Howard sold his house and moved to be closer to his sister. He said he wanted a new start. Before leaving, he gave me a firm handshake, thanking me for standing firm. Mike expanded his security system, offering to share access with nearby families. The community, once divided, now felt like a team. A month later, I received a letter from the court. The psychiatric evaluation had been completed. Karen was officially diagnosed with a severe obsessive disorder and paranoia. She had been transferred to a treatment facility under supervision. The letter explained she would serve her sentence there, with the possibility of continued treatment after release. I read it twice, then set it down. My wife asked what it said. I told her the system had chosen healing as much as punishment. She sighed, saying maybe that was what Karen had needed all along. As the sun set that evening, I walked the yard with the baby cradled against my chest. The air smelled of freshly cut grass, sprinklers ticking in rhythm. Neighbors waved from porches, smiling. The weight of the past months eased slowly from my shoulders. This place was finally home again, and though Karen's shadow had loomed long, the light had returned stronger. The first few weeks after Karen's sentencing were strangely quiet. The same neighborhood that once felt tense now seemed calmer, as if the air itself had lightened. My wife noticed it first. She said the silence in the mornings was no longer heavy. It was the sound of normal life returning. The sprinklers ticked, birds chirped, kids rode their bikes down the sidewalk, and it finally felt safe to sit on the porch again with the baby without glancing over our shoulders. Even with the peace, my guard never fully dropped. Years of service had wired me to notice small things. A car parked too long on the curb, a shadow moving where it shouldn't, the sound of voices raised just a little higher than normal. I still carried those instincts, but now they weren't fueled by fear. They were sharpened by the knowledge that this time, if anything tried to harm my family again, I was ready, and the community knew it too. People waved more often when they passed by, not out of habit, but out of respect. We had survived something together, and everyone felt it. Mike, the neighbor who installed cameras, became something of a local hero. Folks dropped by to thank him for stepping up when most were too afraid. He laughed it off, saying he just wanted to protect his yard, but I could tell the gratitude meant something to him. He started holding small get-togethers in his driveway. On weekends, grilling burgers and hot dogs. Families came with coolers. Kids ran around with chalk and bubbles, and the simple joy of it felt like medicine for everyone. One evening during one of those gatherings, Howard walked over. He looked older than I remembered, as if the trial had taken years from his life. He told me he was selling his house and moving closer to his sister. He said it wasn't because he couldn't face the neighborhood, but because he needed a new start. He said sometimes a place holds too many ghosts, and he didn't want to live in the shadow of Karen's mistakes forever. Before he left that night, he pulled me aside. He said he was grateful for how I had stood firm, not with anger, but with discipline. He said he hoped one day Karen would understand what she had done, but until then, he was glad the community had someone steady to lean on. I shook his hand, and I could see the relief in his eyes. Life settled into a routine. Mornings on the porch with coffee, afternoons fixing up little things around the house, evenings with my wife and son. The baby was growing quickly, his laugh filling the rooms in a way that made every sacrifice worth it. He became the heart of our home, and somehow the heart of the neighborhood too. People would stop by just to wave at him, and it reminded everyone what we had been protecting all along. It wasn't just property lines or rules. It was family, safety, and dignity. Still, reminders of Karen lingered. Sometimes at night, I caught myself replaying the trial in my head, her voice shouting in the courtroom, the way her eyes darted around, like a trapped animal. I thought about the judge's order for treatment and wondered if it would help her. I wanted to believe it could, not for her sake alone, but for everyone who had been caught in a spiral of control. My wife told me I carried too much weight thinking about her, but she also admitted she thought about it too. Healing doesn't come all at once. It comes in small steps, sometimes slower than we expect. The biggest step came when a letter arrived from the treatment facility where Karen had been sent. It was not from her directly, but from a counselor. It explained that she was undergoing therapy and that progress was slow but present. They said she still refused to accept full responsibility, but moments of clarity were starting to appear. The counselor's words struck me. Sometimes the strongest walls begin to crumble with the smallest cracks. I read the letter to my wife, and we sat in silence afterward. We didn't know if Karen would ever truly change, but the idea that she might be facing herself for the first time felt like closure we hadn't expected. The neighborhood began to rebuild in more ways than one. The HOA board, now led by a quiet, practical man named Thomas, focused less on strict rules and more on real needs. Instead of petty notices about lawn height, the board organized a cleanup of the community park, repaired the broken swing set, and set aside funds to repaint faded street signs. For the first time, it felt like leadership was about serving, not controlling. People showed up willingly to help, proving that a neighborhood thrives not from fear but from trust. During one of those park cleanup days, I found myself holding my son as I hammered a loose board back into a bench. A woman nearby smiled and said it was good to see a veteran putting his skills to use here at home. I smiled back, realizing she was right. My battles overseas had ended years ago, but a different kind of mission had begun right here. Protecting family, protecting neighbors, not with weapons, but with steadiness, patience, and presence. It was a mission I had not chosen, but one I would never walk away from. Even so, a part of me stayed watchful. I knew the story wasn't over. Karen might return one day. The system might release her when treatment was complete. And if that day came, I didn't know how the neighborhood would react. Some might fear her, some might pity her, some might still carry anger. But I knew one thing with certainty. If she ever tried to bring chaos back into our lives, she would find a community no longer afraid. She would find a Navy SEAL who had already faced worse storms and survived. That thought gave me peace. Not because I wanted a confrontation, but because I knew I no longer lived with dread. I lived with readiness. And readiness, I had learned long ago, is the best antidote to fear. As the sun set one evening, I carried the baby onto the porch. My wife joined me, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders. We watched as neighbors walked their dogs, kids chased each other, and sprinklers arced across glowing lawns. The quiet no longer felt fragile, it felt earned. The fight had been long, but it had given the neighborhood something no HOA rule ever could. A sense of unity, a promise that if anyone tried to tear it down again, we would stand together. I looked at my son and knew he would grow up in a place stronger than before. A place where people had learned the cost of silence and the value of courage. And though the scars of the past remained, they were reminders not of weakness, but of survival. The counselor's letter about Karen stayed on our kitchen counter for weeks. My wife kept glancing at it while she fed the baby, and I caught myself reading it over again every few days. It was strange, almost unsettling, to think about her in a treatment center instead of storming across someone's yard with a clipboard in her hand. The neighborhood had moved forward, but her shadow was still there. Some neighbors wanted to believe she could come back healed. Others thought the system was wasting time. It became a quiet debate whenever people gathered. Forgiveness or fear? Which one would define us if she ever returned? Mike, always practical, told me during one of his driveway cookouts that we should expect the worst but hope for the best. He said the cameras he had installed were staying up no matter what, and he was adding more angles just in case. People laughed and teased him for being paranoid, but I noticed they didn't complain about the safety his cameras brought. I respected that. Being prepared doesn't make you paranoid. It makes you steady. It was around that time that an odd thing started happening. Anonymous notes began appearing in mailboxes. They weren't violent or directly threatening, but they carried a strange tone. Phrases like "some leaders are only gone for now," or "you can't erase true authority." They were typed, with no handwriting to trace, and nobody saw who delivered them. At first, people thought it might be kids playing pranks, but the words felt heavier than that. There was speculation Karen had convinced someone on the outside to act for her, maybe an old ally, maybe someone who still thought she had been wronged. The air of peace we had built began to ripple with our knees. The retired sheriff who lived a few streets over stepped in quietly. His name was Dale, and though he didn't say much most days, his presence carried weight. He visited neighbors, listened to concerns, and reminded everyone that law enforcement took Karen's case seriously. He even partnered with Mike to set up a neighborhood watch schedule. People who had once been too intimidated by Karen now carried flashlights on evening walks, watching not in fear but with determination. The community was learning what it meant to protect itself. For me, the challenge was balancing caution with calm. My wife worried whenever she saw a note in someone's mailbox. She asked if it meant Karen still had a grip on us. Even from a distance, I held her hand and told her the truth, that I had no way of knowing. But what I did know was that no one would ever touch our child, not while I was alive. She nodded, and I could see the comfort in her eyes, though the worry never left completely. Parenthood brings a new kind of fear, one that doesn't go away. You just learn to carry it. The strangest moment came when Howard, Karen's brother, showed up on my porch one afternoon. He looked thinner than before, his shoulders slumped as if he carried a load he couldn't set down. He asked if he could speak privately, so I invited him in. He sat at the table, his hands shaking as he held a cup of coffee. He said he had something important to share, and that he didn't know who else he could trust. He told me Karen had reached out from the treatment facility. Phone calls were limited, but in one of them she had hinted that she still had friends outside who would keep her influence alive. Howard admitted he didn't know who she meant, but he suspected one of the HOA's former lawyers, a slick man who always backed Karen's most extreme proposals. Apparently this lawyer had left quietly after the trial, but not before warning Howard that the neighborhood hadn't seen the last of them. Hearing this made my stomach tighten. It wasn't just paranoia. There were still pieces of her power floating around. Howard said he was tired of carrying the burden of her actions. He wanted to testify further, to share every detail he had about Karen's schemes and the lawyer's role. He told me he had spoken with investigators already, but felt I deserved to hear it from him personally. His voice cracked when he admitted he wished he had spoken up sooner. Maybe things would not have gone so far if he had. I didn't blame him. People get trapped in the shadow of family loyalty. Breaking out takes courage. I told him it wasn't too late to do the right thing. His eyes filled with tears, and for the first time I saw a man freed from silence. When Howard left, my wife asked what he wanted. I told her pieces of the truth. Not everything, but enough for her to know we had to stay sharp. She nodded, and I saw the familiar look in her eyes, fear mixed with trust. She knew I would protect them, but she also knew danger wasn't finished with us yet. Days later, Dale knocked on my door. He carried a stack of the anonymous notes neighbors had saved. He said the sheriff's office was looking into them, and they matched the style of other letters tied to HOA intimidation cases in nearby communities. Apparently, Karen and that lawyer had used similar tactics before. It was part of their pattern, creating fear with words before striking with actions. Hearing that confirmed what Howard had shared. This wasn't random. It was deliberate. I thanked Dale, and after he left, I sat on the porch holding my son. He was small, fragile, innocent. The thought of anyone trying to tear apart the life we had built around him filled me with a steady fire. Not rage, not panic, but the calm strength that had carried me through storms before. I whispered a promise to him that no matter what shadows tried to crawl back into our world, his father would always be ready. He stirred in my arms, and I held him closer. The next HOA meeting was unlike any before. Instead of bickering about lawn lengths or mailbox colors, people filled the hall with serious faces, ready to talk about protection, unity, and the future. Thomas opened the meeting by addressing the notes directly. He assured everyone that cooperation with law enforcement was ongoing, and that anyone who felt threatened should come forward. For the first time, the HOA wasn't a weapon in the hands of one person. It was a shield held by many. The community was learning to be strong, not because it had no choice, but because it had chosen courage over fear. As the meeting ended, I stood in the back with my wife and child. Neighbors nodded to us as they passed, their eyes filled with something I hadn't seen before. Not just relief, respect. They knew we had faced the storm together, and that together we would face whatever came next. I carried that thought home with me, steady and unshaken, ready for the chapters still ahead. The weeks after the HOA meeting felt uneasy. The surface of the neighborhood looked calm, kids playing on lawns, sprinklers clicking in the early mornings, neighbors waving from their but underneath, everyone felt it. The notes had stopped, but the silence was heavier than the words had been. I could tell from the way people lingered near Mike's cameras and from the way Dale kept patrolling, even when nobody asked him to. We all sensed something was coming. We just didn't know when or where. Howard stopped by again, this time with a folder in his hands. He placed it on my table and pushed it toward me. Inside were photocopies of emails, old meeting minutes, and notes written in Karen's careful script. They outlined plans she had worked on with the HOA's former lawyer. His name was Richard Cole, and though I had seen him only once in passing, his reputation carried weight. Slick, ambitious, always bending rules to suit his client. Howard explained that Richard had a habit of protecting Karen, even when she was clearly crossing lines. He was the one who drafted the animal identification ordinance that tried to restrict service dogs. He was the one who encouraged Karen to go after families she thought were weak. And now, Howard suspected he was the one behind the letters. I scanned through the papers. One email in particular stood out. It was written months before Karen's arrest, but it carried the same cold tone as the anonymous notes. Words about maintaining control, about not letting undesirable elements weaken the neighborhood. It sent a chill through me. Richard had believed in their vision of absolute authority, and without Karen in charge, maybe he wanted to carry that torch himself. Later that week, Mike called me over to his driveway. He showed me footage from one of his cameras. A man in a suit, tall with slicked back hair, had been parked in a sedan across the street for nearly an hour. He never stepped out, just sat there, watching houses. Mike didn't recognize him, but when he zoomed in, I felt my chest tighten. It looked like Richard. I told Mike not to approach him. Not yet. We needed to be smart. That night, after my wife and I put the baby to sleep, I sat at the kitchen table with Dale. We went over everything. The papers Howard had given me, the footage Mike captured, and the unease that was spreading again. Dale listened quietly, then leaned back with a sigh. He said Richard had a reputation beyond our neighborhood too. He had been connected to several disputes in other communities, always representing power-hungry board members. And though he had never been charged with anything, people whispered about intimidation tactics, about things happening just far enough from the law to avoid handcuffs. Dale's advice was clear. We needed to document everything and get it in the hands of the sheriff's office. I agreed. But deep down I knew waiting for the system to grind forward wasn't enough. I had to be ready myself. That the next day brought confirmation of Richard's involvement. My wife answered the door while I was in the garage. She called me quickly, her face pale. On the porch was an envelope addressed to us. No stamp, no name. Inside was a letter typed in the same style as the anonymous notes. Only this time it was personal. It mentioned our child by name, said the community deserved better than a family hiding behind military credentials, and hinted that proper leadership would soon return. My wife's hands trembled as she held the letter. I took it from her gently, folded it, and slipped it into a folder. She asked if we should pack up and leave. I told her no. If we left, it meant they had already won. That night, I walked the perimeter of our yard with Ranger at my side. The moonlight cut across the grass, and the air carried the smell of wet soil from the sprinklers. I thought about the years of training, the missions overseas, the discipline that had been drilled into me. This wasn't combat, but the mindset was the same. Stay calm, assess threats, protect your people. Fear doesn't win when you refuse to feed it. I looked down at Ranger, his steady gaze meeting mine, and felt the strength settle into me again. We were ready. The next HOA meeting proved more dramatic than the last. Richard himself showed up, walking in as though he still held authority. He wore a sharp suit, his hair combed back perfectly, and carried a leather folder. The room went silent as he took a seat in the front row. Thomas, trying to remain composed, continued the meeting, but Richard interrupted within minutes. He stood up, declaring that the HOA had lost its way without strong leadership, that Karen's removal had been a mistake, and that he intended to run for president in the upcoming election. Murmurs rippled across the room. Some people looked shocked, others frightened. For a moment, it felt like the old days, when Karen's shadow ruled every conversation. I stood in the back, arms crossed, watching. Richard's voice was smooth, persuasive, filled with confidence. But when he glanced in my direction, I caught a flicker of something darker in his eyes. He wasn't just there to run for office. He was there to remind me that this fight wasn't over. After the meeting, I noticed Howard sitting off to the side, his head in his hands. He knew what Richard was capable of, and he feared the community might fall for the same tricks again. I walked over, placed a hand on his shoulder, and told him we would face this together. For once, he didn't look broken. He looked determined. That night, my wife asked if things would ever go back to normal. I told her normal was gone, but that didn't mean peace was. We just had to build it stronger this time. She held the baby, close, rocking him gently, and whispered that she believed me. I looked at them both. I knew why I had to keep standing, not just for myself, for them, for the neighbors who had been afraid too long, for the promise of a life not dictated by people like Karen or Richard. The quiet streets outside looked harmless again, but I knew better. This was the calm before another storm, and when it came, I would be ready. The calm lasted only a few days before Richard made his first move. Early one morning, a stack of papers appeared on my porch. They were notices claiming our fence was too high, our mailbox violated community standards, and even that the baby's stroller on the porch created a safety hazard. Each paper had the HOA letterhead, but Thomas confirmed later that none of it had gone through the board. Richard had printed them himself. It was a game of intimidation, one Karen had played before, and he had picked it up without hesitation. My wife was furious. She slammed the papers onto the counter and asked how long we had to endure this circus. I told her the same thing I told her every time. We would endure it until we won. Ranger padded over, rested his head against her leg, and that small gesture softened her anger. She sighed, kissed the top of his head, and whispered that at least the dog always knew when she needed comfort. That was true. Ranger was more than a partner to me. He was a shield for all of us. Later that day, I caught Richard walking with two men I didn't recognize. They wore sharp suits, carried briefcases, and moved with the air of men who believed they owned the ground they walked on. I knew the type. Hired help. Not muscle, but legal muscle. Richard wasn't just planning to bully us. He was preparing to drag us into court, to bury us in paperwork until we either gave up or left. I had seen enemies use force. Richard wanted to use the system itself as a weapon. That evening, I sat with Dale and Mike in the backyard. We spread out the fake violation notices on the table. Dale studied them carefully, pointing out inconsistencies. The signatures didn't match any board member. The dates overlapped with official meetings, and the wording was lifted from old bylaws that were no longer in effect. Mike nodded and promised he had enough footage from his cameras to show Richard sneaking around at night delivering the papers. It wasn't proof of who typed them, but it was proof of who distributed them. That mattered. Still, the neighborhood was on edge. People whispered again about whether Karen might come back if Richard won the election. At the next meeting, Richard stood tall and delivered a speech about restoring order and protecting property values. His words were polished, almost convincing, but I saw through the performance. He painted anyone who opposed him as reckless and disrespectful of the community. He never mentioned me by name, but the message was clear. I was his target. I waited until he finished before standing. The room grew quiet. I didn't raise my voice or match his theatrics. I simply laid down the fake notices on the table in front of everyone. I asked the room if they believed these were official. Thomas confirmed they were not. I asked who had seen Richard walking late at night with envelopes. A few hesitant hands went up. The tension shifted. Richard's jaw tightened, but his smile never faltered. He said nothing and sat back down. The seed of doubt had been planted, but Richard wasn't done. A week later, a woman from Child Services knocked on my door. My wife froze, clutching the baby tighter. The woman explained that an anonymous tip had claimed our home was unsafe for a newborn. My heart pounded, but I forced my breathing to steady. Ranger sat quietly beside me, sensing the tension. I invited her inside, walked her through every room, showed her the baby's crib, the stocked pantry, the emergency medical supplies. She nodded approvingly, and within minutes, she apologized for the inconvenience. She admitted the tip had sounded suspicious, but protocol required a visit. When the door closed behind her, my wife sat on the couch and broke down in tears. She said she couldn't take much more of this. First Karen, now Richard, always someone trying to rip away the little piece we had built. I sat beside her, held her close, and reminded her of who I was. I wasn't just a man with scars and memories from overseas. I was her husband, her shield, her partner. Nobody was going to take our child. Not then, not ever. That night I replayed the woman's words in my head. Suspicious tip. Anonymous. I knew exactly who had made that call. Richard had stooped lower than Karen ever dared. He had brought the state into our home, hoping to use fear as his sharpest weapon. But fear cuts both ways. When I finally shut my eyes, I dreamed not of battlefields, but of a courtroom filled with neighbors. Richard standing, in chains, his smile gone. It felt like a glimpse of the future, and I held on to it. The next morning Howard stopped by. His voice was quieter than usual, but his eyes carried something new. Resolve. He told me he had overheard Richard on the phone, boasting about how easy it would be to win back control. He laughed about weak families with babies, mocked neighbors who stayed silent, and hinted that he had files on everyone ready to be used as leverage. Howard said he couldn't carry the guilt any longer. He wanted to help us expose Richard. For the first time, I saw him not as a broken man, but as someone reclaiming his courage. Together, we began to map out a plan. Mike would gather more footage. Dale would lean on his contacts in the sheriff's office, and Howard would dig through his old boxes of HOA records for anything Richard had left behind. I would prepare for the confrontation that was coming. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about every family who wanted to live without fear of threats and fake rules. In the evenings, I would sit on the porch, baby in my arms, watching Ranger stretched out at my feet. My wife would rock gently beside me, her eyes softer now, though still shadowed with worry. I told her the storm wasn't over, but we weren't facing it alone anymore. We had friends, allies, and the truth. And the truth, once revealed, has a way of cutting through every lie. Richard thought he could scare us into silence. He thought he could bury us under paper and whispers. But he had forgotten one simple thing. I was not trained to break under pressure. I was trained to endure. And with every attack, every desperate move he made, he only strengthened my resolve. The day was coming when the entire community would see who he truly was. And when that day arrived, there would be no more shadows for him to hide in. The following week brought an eerie calm. Richard was quieter, but that silence carried weight. It reminded me of the stillness before a storm, the kind of silence I had learned to respect overseas. It was never safety, it was preparation, and Richard was a man who thrived on schemes, not peace. My wife sensed it too. She told me the quiet worried her more than the yelling. Ranger must have felt it as well, because he stayed close, rarely leaving my side even for a moment. One afternoon, Dale came over with a folder under his arm. He laid it on the table and spread out the papers. They were old HOA minutes, financial statements, and letters signed by Karen from her time as president. Buried among them were documents Richard had also signed. It wasn't much, but Dale pointed out discrepancies. Money that was marked for landscaping projects never used. Invoices from contractors who didn't exist. Small amounts at first, but over the years it added up to thousands. Richard hadn't just picked up Karen's grudge. He had inherited her greed and added his own flair. I asked Dale if he was sure. He nodded, grim-faced. He told me he had kept silent too long, and this was his way of making things right. I could tell it weighed on him, but there was a spark of pride in his eyes that hadn't been there before. That spark mattered. It meant Richard's lies were cracking. That night, Mike invited me to his garage. He showed me footage from his cameras. Richard walking across yards in the middle of the night. Richard handing envelopes to men in suits. Richard standing in driveways arguing with neighbors, his face red and twisted. But the most damning clip showed Richard meeting secretly with the lawyer he had hired. Their voices were muffled, but the tone was unmistakable. They were planning something. Mike zoomed in on a moment where Richard pulled out a thick envelope and slid it across the hood of a car. The lawyer pocketed it without hesitation. It was a bribe caught in real time. I knew then that Richard was no longer just playing HOA games. He was crossing into criminal territory. But knowing wasn't enough. I needed proof strong enough to hold in court. Strong enough to cut through his speeches and charm. Strong enough that even his allies would turn against him. The next community meeting gave me the first opening. Richard walked in wearing a sharp suit, carrying a binder full of notes. He smiled at everyone, shook hands, made jokes, but I saw the tension in his jaw. He was performing, and he knew the performance had to be perfect. He stood and began another speech about order, discipline, and responsibility. He framed himself as the savior of the neighborhood, the man willing to make tough decisions others were too weak to make. People nodded, some out of habit, some out of fear. When he finished, I rose slowly. My wife sat near the back holding the baby, her face pale but steady. I laid out a few of the documents Dale had uncovered. I didn't accuse Richard directly. I simply asked questions. Why had certain funds been moved without explanation? Why had invoices been approved from contractors who could not be found? Why did the numbers in the statements not add up? The room shifted. Murmurs spread. Richard laughed it off, calling it accounting errors and old misunderstandings. But the laughter didn't reach his eyes. He was sweating. Then I asked the last question. Why had he been seen meeting late at night with a lawyer, sliding envelopes across a car hood? The murmurs turned into gasps. Richard's face turned red. He shouted about lies, about doctored footage, about neighbors with grudges. But the more he yelled, the less convincing he became. People were seeing the cracks for themselves. After the meeting, Thomas approached me. He told me quietly that he was ready to call a vote of no confidence. He said the board could not ignore what had been revealed, but he also warned me. Richard would not go down quietly. He had seen men like him before, clinging to power with both hands, willing to drag everyone down with them. I thanked him and promised that when the time came I would be ready. That night, as I sat on the porch with Ranger at my feet, I thought about how far things had gone. What began as petty notices and whispered threats had grown into fraud, bribery, and intimidation. It was no longer just about protecting my family. It was about protecting the entire community from a man who believed rules were weapons and neighbors were pawns. The fight had grown larger than me, but that was fine. I had faced larger enemies before. Days later, Howard knocked on my door. His hands shook, but his voice was steady. He told me Richard had confronted him, accused him of betrayal, and threatened to expose his past mistakes if he didn't fall back in line. Howard said he was done being afraid. He handed me a box filled with old papers, notes, and letters he had kept hidden for years. Inside were more inconsistencies, more evidence of how Karen and Richard had twisted the HOA to their will. Howard said he wanted to testify if it came to court. His eyes were clear, his guilt replaced with determination. It was another piece of the puzzle falling into place. The tension grew heavier with each passing day. Neighbors spoke in hushed tones. Some avoided eye contact. Others stopped by with quiet words of support. My wife stayed strong, but I could see the worry in her eyes when she held the baby. She knew as well as I did that men like Richard were most dangerous when cornered. One evening, I heard raised voices from across the street. Richard was arguing with his own allies, the lawyer and the two suited men who had visited before. His voice carried through the quiet. He shouted about betrayal, about money, about promises broken. Then there was silence, followed by the sound of doors slamming and cars driving away. Richard stood alone on his porch, fists clenched at his sides, staring out into the night. He was unraveling, and everyone could see it. I knew then the end game was near. The vote Thomas had mentioned was coming. The documents, the footage, the testimonies were ready. Richard had built his power on fear and deception, but fear was fading and deception was being exposed. Soon there would be nothing left for him to hide behind. The storm was moving closer, and when it broke, it would not be me or my family standing in its path. It would be Richard. The day of the emergency meeting arrived, with a strange energy in the air. Neighbors gathered earlier than usual, filling the chairs and lining the walls of the small community center. Whispers filled the room. People were nervous, but not the same kind of nervous as before. It wasn't the fear of Richard's temper, it was anticipation, the feeling that something was about to change. My wife sat near the back with the baby, surrounded by a few supportive neighbors who had grown protective of her. Dale sat near the front, papers in hand. Mike had his laptop, ready to show footage if needed. Howard looked pale but determined. This was the moment we had been working toward. Richard walked in late, but when he did, he made sure everyone noticed. He wore another expensive suit, his hair slicked back, his smile wide. He carried himself like a man in control, but I could see the stiffness in his movements. He was holding himself together with sheer force of will. He shook hands, slapped backs, and joked loudly, but no one laughed as easily as before. The charm was wearing thin. The spell he had cast on the neighborhood was breaking. Thomas, the board's vice president, called the meeting to order. His voice trembled at first, but grew steadier as he went on. He outlined the purpose of the meeting, explaining that concerns had been raised regarding the leadership of the HOA president. Richard leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, smirking as if it were all beneath him. But the smirk faded when Thomas added that multiple neighbors had provided documents and testimony, suggesting financial misconduct, abuse of power, and harassment. I arose and presented the papers Dale had uncovered. I laid them out one by one, explaining how the numbers did not add up. I didn't raise my voice or add emotion. I simply stated facts, letting the evidence speak for itself. Dale followed, confirming that as treasurer he had seen the irregularities but had been pressured to sign off anyway. His voice shook, but the weight of his words filled the room. Then Mike stood, projecting video clips onto a small screen. Richard pacing, arguing, handing off envelopes. The room grew quiet as neighbors leaned in to watch. Richard shifted in his seat, his smile gone. Howard was the last to speak. His voice was soft but steady. He admitted his mistakes, his silence, his part in letting things go on, but he also explained that he had kept records, letters, and memos from years ago that showed Karen and later Richard had manipulated the HOA for personal gain. He held up the box he had given me and placed it in front of Thomas. The effect was powerful. Howard had once been part of their inner circle. Now he stood against them. Richard exploded. He jumped to his feet, shouting about betrayal, lies, and conspiracies. He pointed at me, at Dale, at Howard. He called us cowards, traitors, troublemakers. His voice rose higher and higher until Thomas had to pound his gavel to restore order. Neighbors shifted uncomfortably, some looking away, others whispering. Richard tried to laugh it off, but his voice cracked, and the laugh sounded hollow. Thomas cleared his throat and announced that a vote of no confidence would be held. Hands shot up around the room. At first it was a few, then more, until nearly every hand was raised. Only a small handful remained still, either too afraid or too loyal to Richard to oppose him. The decision was overwhelming. Richard was removed as HOA president effective immediately. The room exhaled, as if a great weight had lifted. Some even clapped. My wife's eyes filled with tears, and for the first time in months, I saw her smile without fear behind it. But Richard wasn't finished. His face twisted with rage, and he slammed his fists on the table. He shouted that none of it mattered, that he still had friends in higher places, that the vote was meaningless. He stormed out of the room, his shoes echoing against the floor. The door slammed behind him, and the room fell silent again. For a moment, no one moved, no one spoke. We all knew it wasn't over. That night, I kept the lights on and Ranger close. Every sound outside made my instincts flare. I checked the locks, walked the perimeter, and kept my phone ready. My wife tried to sleep, but I could see her eyes open in the dark. She whispered that she trusted me, but I knew the fear lingered. Richard had been stripped of his title, but men like him did not accept defeat easily. He would lash out, and we needed to be ready. The next morning, Mike knocked on my door. His face was pale. He showed me new footage from the night before. Richard standing in the street outside his house, pacing, muttering, waving his arms. Then he stopped, pulled out his phone, and made a call. Mike had enhanced the audio just enough to catch a few words. It wasn't clear, but I recognized the tone. Richard was calling in favors, summoning help, preparing something big. Later that day I saw him again. He stood on his porch, tie loose, eyes bloodshot. He shouted across the street, daring me to face him. His words were slurred, his anger barely controlled. Neighbors peeked from behind curtains, some filming on their phones. I didn't respond. I stood silent, Ranger at my side, watching. Richard screamed louder, throwing insults, threats, promises of revenge. But the more he shouted, the smaller he seemed. His power was gone, his grip slipping. All he had left was noise. Still, I knew better than to underestimate him. Desperate men could be dangerous, and Richard was cornered. He had lost his title. His allies were slipping away, and his secrets were spilling into the light. That was when they were most likely to strike, when they had nothing left to lose. I remembered lessons from years past, lessons written in blood and sweat. Always prepare for the last move, because it was never over until the last card was played. That night, I sat on the porch again, the air heavy with heat. Ranger rested at my feet, his ears twitching at every sound. Across the street, Richard's house was dark, too dark. No movement, no lights, no sound. It wasn't peace, it was something else. The storm had broken, but the final lightning had not yet struck. I knew in my bones the showdown was coming, and when it did, it would test not just me, but the strength of the entire community that had finally found its voice. The final act came faster than I expected. 2 nights after the no confidence vote, I woke to Ranger growling low in his throat. His body was tense, his ears forward. I slipped out of bed, my instincts taking over. Through the curtains I saw movement. A figure at the edge of my driveway, then another by the mailbox. I eased toward the door, keeping silent, my mind running through possibilities. I wasn't in the desert anymore, but my body remembered how to move in the dark. Ranger stayed by my side, a quiet shadow. I opened the door just enough to see. Richard was there, flanked by 2 men I didn't recognize. They were bigger, dressed, rough, their movements sloppy but aggressive. Hired muscle. He had really done it. He had brought outsiders into the neighborhood. My wife stirred behind me, whispering a question. I motioned for her to stay quiet. "Stay back," Richard shouted across the lawn. His words were jagged, fueled by anger and something stronger. He accused me of destroying his life, of stealing his power, of turning the neighborhood against him. His voice cracked as he promised that tonight he would take everything back. One of the men beside him cracked his knuckles. The other held a metal bat loosely at his side. They stepped forward, as if this was their stage, their fight to win. I felt a calm settle over me. It was the same calm that had carried me through battles overseas. My breathing slowed, my muscles relaxed, my mind sharpened. Fear had no place. Here, I stepped onto the porch, Ranger close. My voice carried across the yard, steady and controlled. I told them to stop, to think, to turn around before it was too late. But Richard only laughed, a broken, desperate sound. He waved his hand, and the men moved closer. Before they could take another step, lights flashed across the street. Mike's cameras had caught everything, and he had already called the police. Patrol cars rolled up fast, headlights cutting through the night. Officers jumped out, weapons drawn, voices commanding Richard and his men to drop everything. The sudden shift of power froze them in place. The man with the bat hesitated, then dropped it with a clatter. The other raised his hands slowly. Richard screamed at them not to give up, but his words fell flat. The officers swarmed, cuffs clicking, bodies pressed against hoods. Richard fought back, thrashing, cursing, spitting. It took 2 officers to hold him. They read him his rights as neighbors gathered at the edges of their lawns, phones out, faces lit by flashing red and blue. It was the final unmasking. Whatever authority he had claimed was gone. Now he was just another man in cuffs, dragged down the street, his shouts echoing into the night. The following weeks brought the conclusion we all expected but needed to see. Charges stacked against him: harassment, conspiracy, attempted assault, fraud. The 2 men he brought in turned on him quickly, trading testimony for lighter sentences. The shady lawyer who had once defended him went silent, unwilling to risk his own reputation. Even his wife, once a shadow at his side, finally spoke to investigators, admitting she had grown afraid of his temper and his lies. It was the collapse of a man who had built his life on control and intimidation. Court was long but decisive. I sat with my wife, our newborn resting quietly, Ranger at my feet. We listened as the judge laid out Richard's actions in plain words, each count read aloud like nails driven into a coffin. The judge's voice was stern, reminding everyone that no homeowner association, no self-proclaimed leader, stood above the law. Richard tried to speak, tried to charm, then tried to rage, but none of it mattered. His sentence was clear: years behind bars, fines, restitution, no titles, no power, no control left, only consequences. The neighborhood began to change. Meetings were calmer, run by Thomas with help from Dale and others who actually cared about the community. Mike's cameras remained, not as a weapon, but as protection, a reminder that transparency kept people safe. Howard became a quiet advisor, his regret turning into resolve. And neighbors who once stayed silent now spoke freely, their voices stronger, their eyes clearer. Fear no longer held them. At home, life found a rhythm again. My wife smiled more. She sat on the porch with the baby in her arms, watching the sunset without that shadow of worry in her eyes. Ranger rested nearby, always alert, always ready, but more relaxed too. I held my child and felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Peace, not the kind that comes from silence, but the kind that comes from surviving storms and knowing you stood your ground. Sometimes I thought about Richard, about how he had started with a clipboard and rules and ended in chains. It was a reminder that entitlement, when left unchecked, can grow into something darker. But it was also a reminder that communities could fight back, that people could find their courage when pushed too far. He had demanded our newborn once, thinking he could scare us into submission. Instead, he revealed just how fragile his power truly was. The baby stirred in my arms, small eyes blinking up at me. I whispered that the world wasn't always fair, but that we would always protect him. That Ranger and I would always stand watch. My wife leaned against me, her hand on mine. We had faced the worst together, and we had come through stronger. As the days passed, neighbors waved more often, conversations lasted longer, and laughter returned to the streets. The lawns, the palm trees, the pastel houses looked the same, as they always had, But the feeling had shifted. It wasn't just a neighborhood anymore. It was a community, one that had faced its shadows and found light again. And for the first time since moving in, I felt it deep in my chest. We were truly home.